We must uphold our mutually beneficial cooperation and win-win while opposing decoupling. There is no logic in decoupling from China. It's a desire to preserve our national security, just as you do for your own. It's a desire for mutual respect and understanding, and a desire to continue to open up trade, but to ensure that it is fully fair at all times.
Both China and the European Union have a shared interest in peace and security, and in the effective functioning of the rules-based international order.
Smo neretko pritisnuti od mnogih najmoćnijih sila sveta.
Even though we're often pushed by many more powerful forces in the world, we're always happy to have a friend in the People's Republic of China.
That was Serbia's president, ending that little montage of presidents as China's Xi Jinping continues his tour of Europe. And it is that tour that we are talking about today. Hello and welcome to News Desk, a weekly conversation that puts you at the very heart of the discussion. My name's Alex Forrest-Whiting.
And I'm Biresh Banerjee, and I'll be taking those questions, comments and observations that you type into the chat and bring them into this conversation, and also putting them to our experts whom we'll hear from in a moment. So send us your questions and observations. We're looking forward to them.
Yeah, and this week we are talking about China and its relationship with Europe and some of those difficult tensions that seem to be developing, be it trade, be it security, and also some of the divisions within Europe itself over China as China becomes more assertive. So we're asking this question this week: how much does China really need Europe?
And some of you have already weighed in on that question. I have two usernames here, just as an example, as a sample from the comments that we're already getting. So there is this comment from @NewBeginnings413 saying, Europe will never learn. I think we will be expanding on this as the conversation progresses. And then you also have from user @DanielBailey5849 saying, it's a bit of a long one, hopefully he can go to Putin and tell him end this war and stop with nuclear threats and rebuild relationships with Europe again. I'm guessing the he over here is with reference to Xi Jinping. So that's just some of the comments so far. So get typing. Fill up that chat with questions, comments and observations, and we'll bring them into the conversation.
Yeah, great.
And while you are doing that, it's also time to introduce the people at this table, because we're all sat at this table. So starting from my right, Clifford Coonan, DW's own China analyst. Now, Clifford spent about more than a decade reporting and living in China, so he has deep knowledge of the country and how it functions. To his right, Dustin Heberlein, an old hand, a seasoned hand at DW News Desk. You all have seen him before. I think he's back from a holiday.
I'm back from a holiday, so I'm fresh and energized. I'm ready to give you guys whatever you need.
Context would be very good. I think that's what you'll be providing us.
I was hoping for holiday stories, but I'm also willing to give context.
We'll get to the holiday stories in a moment. Let's provide some context to our people. And there's Jared Reed, again, a seasoned hand at DW, who's going to be managing the chat.
Can I have a holiday?
And all the...
Can
we all just have a holiday? Exactly. Can we all just... Maybe after we deal with this visit. That's Jared Reed. Whom you don't see sitting at the table is Michelle Stockman, again, a seasoned DW hand. She's today the producer for this conversation. She's sitting in the technical gallery, is what we call it, with the rest of our very able and apt technical team, which is making this conversation possible.
Yeah, and as well as this fantastic team here and behind the scenes, and of course Clifford, who is our expert on China, we also have two other guests who'll be joining us a little bit later in this stream. Firstly, we have Teresa Fallon, and she is director of the Centre for Russia-Europe-Asia Studies, and she's going to be talking quite a bit about China and Europe's relationships when it comes to trade, when it comes to security. And after her, we will be joined by Tamas Matura, who is a an associate professor from Corvinus University of Budapest, and he will be talking about Hungary's relationship with both the EU and, of course, China. So definitely worth staying and hanging around to hear what they have to say.
And those experts are coming up in a moment. So everybody in the chat, send us your questions, comments, or observations. We can put them to our experts when they join us, and that's happening quite soon. But before that, we have something for you to do. We have a poll question that you should really answer. It should be visible in the chat. Jared Reed has more on that.
That's right. So please do vote. I'm going to read out the poll now. It's what do you think defines China-Europe relations? So number 1, partnership and shared interests. Option number 2, rivalry, competition and distrust. Number 3, so both partnership and rivalry, depending on the situation. And number 4, the classic, it's too complicated. And at the moment, both is just a little bit ahead of the option of rivalry. So we'll see how that develops over the course of the next hour or so.
Exactly, and we will have the results for you at the end of that conversation. I mean, we also don't know how long this conversation is going to be. I think we could talk about this for hours.
A long time, and it's going to be a packed stream. And
but we also want to go for a holiday, so we can't talk forever.
You make us sound lazy.
Yeah. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Jared. And before we get going, let's just have a bit of a catch-up, Dustin, with what has been going on with President Xi's visit. Has it all been, excuse my French, bonhomie?
Ooh la la. Sorry.
I mean, no, I will excuse your French. No, so of course we didn't just pick like Europe and China. Obviously, you can always talk about Europe and China relations, but we picked it because Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, is visiting Europe at the moment. He is going to France first, and Serbia, then Hungary, and then he just so. What I can already talk about is the visit in France. He has met Macron, like the French president, and knowing Macron, he always tries to, for a personal touch in his diplomacy, and we actually have some pictures of that where you can see like how he took Xi Jinping to his favorite childhood holiday spot. It's like a village in the Pyrenees in
lovely
French.
weather.
Yeah, lovely
Oh, my
weather.
goodness.
Yeah, there's been lots of comments about how this weather kind of ruined this, what was supposed to be like a very, personal, nice outing.
Dear.
They're enjoying it.
Are they?
I mean,
What's not to enjoy?
they have to smile for the cameras, I guess. I imagine it must have been pretty cold. But yeah, this is where Macron spent his childhood vacations apparently, and that's like what you're seeing there is like a French folk dance. So that's just what's the local culture, I guess. But what did they actually talk about? You know, so she did say that he, like the biggest development, I guess, he asked for like a peace during during the next Olympics in the summer, a world peace. That's which are
being held in Paris.
Yeah, they call it an Olympic truce. Like it's a long tradition. Other heads of state have asked for this before, and this brings him. This is kind of how far he's willing to go when referencing the Ukraine war, because like he's famously. China's not delivering weapons to Russia, is what they say, but still, obviously, Europe would like them to go further with embargoes. So that's been a big talking point. And if you zoom out a bit, you can really see that like Europe is a bit on the fence when it comes to China. Macron is more on the side of, let's be friends with China. But on the other hand, there's been lots of talks of like, does Europe need to be a bit careful as well? You know, the US and China are like have tense relationships right now. So the question is like maybe Europe should be a bit more careful with what they want from China, and maybe careful with their supply routes as well, not to rely too much on them economically in case a conflict ever approaches. And Xi Jinping's next stop is Serbia, so that's where he
is at the moment, isn't
he? That's where he's at the moment, and he will be visiting an embassy that has been bombed by NATO in 1999, I think. So that's a bit of a hint as well. You know, he's like hinting towards NATO overreaching its. Oh yeah, that's the aftermath of the bombing back then. And
It just needs to be added, it was an accidental bombing.
yeah, it was an accidental bombing. So there's
Yeah.
The White House apologized for it.
And pay
Yeah.
compensation even for it,
Yeah.
but clearly they haven't been forgiven.
Yeah, but still, obviously, this is a nod towards like NATO overreaching what they are supposed to do. You know.
Yeah.
And then next up is Hungary, which we will talk about later in the
Yeah.
program as well. Where like we expect that the visits in like Serbia and Hungary are like a bit more easy for Xi Jinping
Yeah.
than the visit in France. Like he will get more pushback from Macron than he will get and the other countries. But you might notice there's a bunch of countries I didn't mention that are also in the EU that Xi Jinping did not visit. He did not visit Germany. He did not visit Italy. And actually, I was hoping that Clifford could maybe get in on this and like talk to us
definitely.
about why did Xi Jinping dislike these countries? Why is this where he's going?
Well, it's a funny thing. China really likes France, and the Chinese Communist Party really likes France. And some of the great leaders of the Communist Party, Deng Xiaoping, who was the architect of economic reform in the 80s, he studied in Paris. Zhou Enlai, one of the early premiers of China, he studied in Paris. There's always been this sort of, they've always had a sort of a revolutionary link. They've always felt a revolutionary link to France. And they've always felt that France stood alone in Europe as an outlier. So there's a lot of respect there for the French. That said, I think this visit overall is about a lot more than that. I think it's about actually starting a rift or building on a rift within Europe. It's about dividing Europe. It's a strategic masterclass in many ways, the choice of the countries involved. Each has their own different position in terms of creating disorder within the European framework. Mm-hmm. Serbia is always an outlier, very close to Putin, also trying to get into the EU, but increasingly looking remote from the EU accession, or looking increasingly remote from the EU accession race. Then Hungary is obviously an EU member, but has very much hitched its wagon both to China in economic terms and also to Putin in ideological terms, and this sort of authoritarian alliance there.
Right.
And then France is feeling a little bit left out of defense networks that you see in Asia. Yeah. We've had France submarine sales that have fallen by the wayside, and so it feels excluded from some of the geopolitical stuff in the region, in the Asian region. And also then within Europe, Germany has been very successful at getting its cars and getting its chemicals into the Chinese market, and French companies have not been as successful as that, and definitely France wants to boost that. So it's really looked for the sort of the weak points within the European framework and is working on those.
Just a quick thing on France. The community is commenting on it. Ted Wang, for example, saying the only independent country in Europe is France, I think. And there is a particular question for you, Clifford. Maybe you want to answer it as the conversation progresses, or now, briefly. It's from Sean Rice, and it's for you, Clifford, saying, while the question is EU relations with China, the issue seems complicated by the fact that each country in the EU seems to be pursuing its own diplomacy. And this perhaps goes to the point of driving a wedge and a masterclass in strategy. Maybe you want to address this very briefly and then we can move on?
Yeah, I think they definitely identified the weak points, and the fact that we had Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, visiting there recently with a large trade delegation of German car makers and other industrial groups. That didn't, whatever about he said it was there to help to try and push for Chinese support against the war in Ukraine. But ultimately, a lot of it was about selling German products to the Chinese, and that was certainly the optics of the visit. And the optics are very important with these messages because, as we've just seen with the dancing in the snow, the optics are bad. And so these things are very important. And so I think the question is correct. I think that China has spotted that Europe doesn't really know what to do. It's come up with this vague strategy of de-risking, which Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commissioner, has been pushing, which is not about decoupling, but about reducing the risk of exposure to China. But at the same time, everyone's going their own path, and China is very happy to sow this dissent, because ultimately the big prize is always going to be Europe as it stands versus in relation to the US, because the US is the world's biggest power.
Thank you very much, Clifford, and thank you for being with us for all of this. And you mentioned Ursula von der Leyen, who we're going to come to in a moment. But first of all, let me bring on our first guest, who is very kindly joining us down the line. And it is Teresa Fallon. Hi, Teresa. Thank you very much for joining us. She's director of the Centre for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies, also known as CRIAS. I think that's how you pronounce it. And before we start talking, let's just listen to Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, who seemed to be pretty strong or have a very strong message for China when it comes to trade and the fact that China seems to certainly have the upper hand when it comes to goods in Europe. So let's just listen to what she had to say.
Chinese subsidized products. These subsidized products, such as the electric vehicles or, for example, steel, are flooding the European market. At the same time, China continues to massively support its manufacturing sector, and this combined with a domestic demand that is not increasing, the world cannot absorb China's surplus production.
So strong words there from Ursula von der Leyen, using that word flooding. And it is true to say, isn't it, that there is this huge trade deficit between the EU and China. I was reading that it's 291 billion euros in 2023. So I'd love to get your take on this, Teresa. Do you think that Ursula von der Leyen, that the EU, are they panicking, or are they now really trying to push back?
Well, I think that over the years, they've always asked for the same things, a level playing field, and it's just repeating the same thing over and over again. But now we see this dramatic trade deficit. And over the last 10 years, the EU has prepared a special toolbox to protect their own economy. And now the China challenge is so massive for them that sanctions are really on the table. So, you know, about 2005, we saw bra wars. So this kind of negotiations that were going on about textiles coming into Europe. Fast forward about 15 years later, we're talking about car wars. Yeah. So the dramatic rise of Chinese manufacturing has really affected Europe. And they, in addition to that, China published about 10 years ago, Made in China 2025, and they laid out very clearly all the areas that they were going to work on. And one of them was electric vehicles. So my question is, why didn't the EU prepare sooner for this? Now we have ports filled with cars, Chinese cars waiting to enter the market, and no one's sure what will happen to those because they're debating about what type of sanctions or issues will be put on. Will be a 10%, 15% tariff.
Do you think that those? Do you think they will follow through with those tariffs? I know they're threatening huge amounts, up to 50% or so, but do you think they would actually follow through and do that to China?
See, that's the issue. You mentioned 50%. Well, I don't think they have the will to put up 50%. The 50% tariff is the only way, because the Chinese cars are so low priced that is the only way it would make a difference. So now they're talking about maybe 10 or 15%. So it's not really going to have as much of an effect. So will they have the bravery to use this toolbox is the first question. And we saw with the recent meeting in Paris, Chancellor Scholz, you know, he had a kind of a meeting inside a public restaurant with Macron, but he refused to go to the meetings with Xi and Macron. So I think that that's a symbol of, or a sign of, the breakage in the traditional Franco-German engine, that they're on different sides of the debate on this. And Macron did what every European leader loves to do. He had to have a positive relationship with Xi Jinping, and he let Ursula von der Leyen do all the dirty work and talk about sanctions. So he was just the nice guy, and she had to do all the dirty work. And we've seen this happen over the years. This is what the EU structures. That's it's handy for European leaders to blame everything on Brussels.
Teresa Biresha, it's good to see you again. And because people are writing in questions and observations in the chat, I just want to sort of bring them to you. There is an observation from Ted Wang, a user. He's saying, in China, most people see EU as partner, not rival. On the other end of it, you have a question from Alien from Zeta B. Oh, that's the username. And the question is this: has Europe given up on China democratizing, or do they care only about trade?
Oh, two excellent questions. Thank you for those. The first question, I think, refers to the 2019 EU white paper that referred to China as a partner, a rival, a systemic rival, and a competitor. And so this is like a three-basket approach, which in 2019 seemed, like a really big deal, but it's really kind of a fudge. So it means China is all things. And Beijing has tried very hard to remove the systemic rival language. They're not happy with that. And I think that trying to compartmentalize their relationship with China, saying economics are in one basket. China's not happy with this. They use their leverage wherever they can. And, this is Brussels' attempt. There are many people calling for an update on all of this, but, no one wants to rock the boat too much in member state capitals. In regard to the other question about democracy promotion, that's a very good question. I mean, Europe is always talking about their values and how that's so important for all of them. But we've seen, for example, Volkswagen built a car manufacturing plant in Xinjiang. There have been questions about forced labor in these supply chains. And even at the European Parliament and institutions, they're really dragging their feet on having actual legislation on forced labor laws. Now, if you compare that to the United States, forced labor laws are part of their DNA because of their history. So in the 1930s, there's no, they do not allow things to be imported that are under forced labor. So Europe has been kind of dragging their feet on that, but I think eventually it got over the hump. So they have a very different approach, and I think that no one is under any illusion any longer, at least in my perception, that they have an ability to promote democracy in China. So I think the bigger, more wide-ranging question is, how do we deal with these illiberal countries like Russia and China in the current world order? That's our biggest challenge right now.
I just want to bring it back to something that Clifford mentioned earlier, which is that Xi Jinping's one of his main aims is really to divide Europe. And you mentioned there, you were talking about Germany, so we don't have to even go very far from France, its neighbour Germany, and the more cosy relationship Scholz seemed to have had, certainly on his visit to China in the past few weeks. I'd just like to get your views about that, and just how you see it playing out, for example, with Germany. Scholz, Chancellor Scholz, very keen to make sure that German business is always protected and is not threatened at all by any of these talks of probes or tariffs, etc.
Well, Germany is quite an interesting situation. It's the biggest economy in Europe, and their most important trade partner for several years now is China. So it's Germany's #1 trade partner. But if you look at the statistics and figures, it's declining. Volkswagen isn't making as much profits in China. And China had a very smart strategy when they approached Germany. And if you look at the history, when you had when Germany was divided, Eastern Germany actually had built a gigantic factory in China. They had already these types of relations that went back a long time ago. And so I think when China was looking to build up their economy, they turned to Germany. Yeah. And they have ties with 5 major groups, I would say. So the automotive sector, the chemical sector with BASF, and Siemens. So I'll just make it 3, just to keep it simple.
And let me interrupt you briefly there, because I know that Dustin has got quite an interesting graph that we can show, which compares, well, he can talk about it, but it compares Germany in exports with China compared to other European countries. I think we can just bring that up and very briefly just explain what we're seeing when we see that graph, hopefully when we can see it.
Yeah, exactly. It's basically illustrating what Teresa's saying here, right? Like, this shows how, this is showing exports in relation to each country's GDP. So it's kind of it doesn't depend on like the size of the economy. It's like relative to how big the economy is, the exports. You can see how it's really in the late 2000s. So yeah, the orange is Germany, and blue is the EU in general. France is green. You can see UK in red and Italy in yellow. And really, the top line is sort of what we're looking at. And you can see the late 2000s, like how a big part of the German economy became like of the German exports became China focused, and even in like 2009, 2010, 2011, when we had like a financial crisis, you can see how this is actually going up. So basically, Germany was securing its stance in European economies.
And Teresa, that makes sense with what you were just talking about with some of those big industries that have really been focusing on China.
So they've kind of carefully cultivated these larger industries, and they do the lobbying for China. They have the chancellor's ear. So a lot of policy at the EU level, because of the size of Germany and the importance that China has on their economy, a lot of the policy is really based from Berlin. So we see that their input really kind of literally drives EU policy. So now we're seeing maybe some difficulties in all of that because of other competing interests. But overall, Germany has had a big say in how things were run. And Angela Merkel, I mean, we saw in the past, for example, with the solar industry about 10 years ago, the Chinese officials didn't go to Brussels. They went to Berlin to discuss these types of things. So, there's also a bit of a turf war going on here. And since then, the toolbox, the European Commission, they really have a big say in economic issues. So we're going to see how this all plays out. But I'm seeing some tensions in regard to turf. And Ursula von der Leyen is German. She's a former German defense minister. And she owes her job to Macron. So now we're coming up to the elections in June. And she went with him to Paris. But I will be curious how this plays out, because there's no guarantee she's going to have her job. I think it's very likely, but there could be some pressure on her as well.
There's some interesting takes coming on the relationship between China and EU, and I just want to sort of bring that in so that we have it on our radar in our discussions. So there is Ted Wang again saying there are tons of European products sold in China. EU-China relationship should be mutual benefit. And then there is another user with Chinese characteristics, with Chinese characters that I cannot read. I will just read out the comment saying, China need EU to be a strong polar in multipolar era, not just a follower of US. I'm sure this is a point that we're going to discuss. And just one last comment from username Bida saying, China's choice was aimed to bring together France, the most important EU country, with the pro-China countries like Serbia and Hungary, create a strong China-friendly EU axis, France, Hungary, and Serbia. Just so it's there in the discussion.
Throwing that into the conversation.
That's fantastic. I'll pick up on the last point. We should keep in mind that Serbia is not a member of the EU, although they're very pro-China and Russia. And they still, I was looking at figures, I think this budget period, they're getting 571 million for possible accession. I think Serbia, the figures, they were much closer to European accession several years ago than they are now. And that's largely due to Chinese investments kind of pulling them away from the acquis, the rules that run the EU. So Serbia is kind of moving further away from Europe. But I agree with the comments that Xi Jinping is very interested in how things look. And, I tease some French colleagues that, oh, wow, you're in the same basket as Hungary and Serbia. They're not happy to hear that, right? But that's how Xi Jinping sees it.
I just like...
So they don't put in that basket. But the other thing we should keep in mind as well, that, and it's very clear, the Chinese make no bones about it, their strategy is to divide the transatlantic alliance. So anything that is divisive or to throw wedges where there's any openings, that's what they try to do. And in the recent spy case with the Belgian former senator, it was on the Ministry of State Security was corresponding via phone messages. And it was kind of, we've always suspected that. And we've also heard that in closed door events from Chinese officials, but actually seeing it on a message like our goal is to divide Europe from the US. So, I mean, that's really clear. That's what they're trying to do here.
And that brings us on to a very interesting topic in itself, doesn't it? The whole issue of security. And you mentioned about dividing Europe from the US. Of course, we had Macron previously calling for more strategic autonomy and less reliance on the US. This must play very nicely into what President Xi and the Chinese want.
Well, I think that statement, I mean, it's a perennial French call since de Gaulle. But I mean, I think others talk about strategic responsibility. What the US needs is a more responsible Europe. They have been taking a holiday from history for the last 30 years and haven't really spent enough on their own defense. So I think the US would welcome a more countries that will spend more on their defense. So we've seen with the invasion of Ukraine, over 2 years into the war now, it is starting to improve. Poland has spending a lot because they're on the front line. But there's still many member states that aren't even reaching the 2% that they had promised over a decade ago. So so I think the US, everyone would like Europe to have more developed defense industry and an ability to defend themselves, as we see that it's even hard for them to send artillery shells.
But it must work in China's favour, surely, that you've even got the President of France saying very boldly that, look, there needs to be more of a division from the US. You've just talked about China trying to, divide the transatlantic alliance.
Well, that's true. We saw very clearly when Macron visited Xi Jinping in China, and he went there saying, I'm going there to talk to him, to use his influence to help stop the war in Russia's war in Ukraine. And he left with the bumper sticker saying, we don't want to be a vassal of the United States. Yeah. So for a while, with the initial invasion of Ukraine, there was no talk about strategic autonomy because everyone realized that NATO wasn't brain dead, but that it was really necessary. And that leadership was being, they pulled everyone together to kind of show solidarity and helped with the war in Ukraine. So now Macron is like resurfacing this narrative, which I think is quite bad timing, actually.
Before we just sort of go ahead, can we just take a moment to appreciate that phrase that you just used to try and describe how Europe has not been shouldering the burdens of security over the past 30 years? Holiday from history. I think it is a magnificent description of the way Europe has been performing, or rather not performing, over the past 30 years. So thank you for that.
I'd just like to, you were just talking about Macron and Ukraine, and of course that was top of the agenda, one of Macron's main points that he wanted to press home to President Xi. How do you think that went? Do you think he's managed to put any pressure at all on China over its great friendship with Russia?
Well, it doesn't seem like it. I think that they have to go through the motions, and they always ask Xi Jinping. And I mean, I think the Europeans will continue to ask, and Xi will pretend to not support Russia. And, the Russians and Xi and Putin will meet very shortly after this, laugh about it, and then the Europeans will think they've done great diplomacy. So I think that there's this belief that they have to continue to do the same thing over and over because they don't want China to sell even or send even more advanced technology or weapon systems to the war. So this is kind of their thinking behind it. I even had a chance to speak to High Representative Joseph Borrell at a conference. I asked him that question, and the narrative from him was, well, it could be worse. Yes, they might be sending these dual-use goods. This is what I'm saying. They could be sending them, these dual-use goods, but, and then this is what Borrell said, but they could be sending much more advanced things. So they are continuing to ask to use this influence. But I think Xi is actually getting tired of it. And when I speak to Chinese interlocutors here in Brussels, they're like, we can't control Russia. They're so unruly and we have a tough time with them and don't ask us to help. So, I mean, I think the narrative is evolving from the Chinese.
I'd love to get Clifford's view on that. Is that something that you would that would ring true to you?
Well, I always think back to when she went to Moscow last year and met Putin, and as he was leaving the Kremlin, they sort of had a moment together where she said to Putin, "We are making changes here that have not been seen for 100 years," and they embraced, and he drove off into the sunset. And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing this unfold. China doesn't really care what Europe says about what's happening in Ukraine, because it's quite happy just to create confusion. It's another possibility. It's saying, well, we're not giving them weapons. We're not supporting them. China will kind of say whatever it needs to say, because basically Europe is unlikely to do anything about it. You're just going to see trade delegations going there and saying, well, we're going to get some concessions on defence. But ultimately, the holiday from history,
The holiday.
But just on that point, maybe we can discuss this further in other sections of this conversation. And maybe, Teresa, if you're listening in, maybe you can come in on this little after Clifford has said something on this. This continued support for Russia over the war in Ukraine, isn't it also hurting Chinese interests here in Europe, particularly when you look at the Eastern nations, the Eastern European nations? And I'm talking about the 16+1 format, which really hasn't worked out as much in China's favor. And I would imagine that the support for Russia is a strong factor in that, is it not?
I think so. And I think sometimes when we think of Europe, we tend to think of Western Europe.
Exactly.
And actually, when you look at Central Europe and you look at the Baltic states, they're furious about how things are going. And they see Russia as the biggest threat. The Finns, for years, Finland, the foreign minister said a couple of years ago, the three biggest threats that Finland faces are Russia, Russia, and Russia. And for them, this is a tragedy, a travesty, and they're really pushing back. And this is another division then within the EU, because you have the Western European states that are frankly just cashing in, and there are some concerns. I mean, if we look at industrial policy, I don't want to go off topic, but I think it relates a little bit to what we were talking about earlier. A lot of the German companies are changing their mind about Germany because of the Nokia factor. How Nokia disappeared because ultimately it was just done cheaper elsewhere. Gradually, companies like Volkswagen, even BASF, they're losing some of their competitive advantage because China has absorbed all their technology. And the technology transfer has taken place. So people are having to think about on the technology side. The technology side feeds into security policy because you're suddenly realizing that this technology is going to be used for nefarious means.
Let's just bring in Teresa on this. Teresa, you wanted to sort of come in on this point, right?
I do. I think that China has no problem speaking out of both sides of their mouth. We saw several months ago with the number 3 head of the Chinese Communist Party went to speak in Moscow at Russia's Duma. It's like their parliament. And the Russians, of course, taped him. And then they released the video. And this Chinese official, very high-ranked Chinese official, said, "We will help you undermine European sanctions." And so, of course, people see what they want to see, and the Chinese still manage to get around this. So they tell people what they want to hear in Brussels, I think. I hope there's more skepticism, but they have no trouble, speaking out of both sides of their mouth. They were probably mad with the Russians for releasing that, and then the video disappeared online. But they're able to kind of send all these people with different messages here, and I think if they're not that motivated and don't really understand. But I agree with Clifford. The Central Eastern Europeans, apart from Hungary, were very look, Russia and China are together on this. And other countries, well, it might not suit their purposes to see that Russia and China are together on this, or they feel that they're so sophisticated that they can somehow drive a wedge between Russia and China through their actions, which I think is a fool's errand. I think these two major countries have their own strategic convergence, and it's been going on for a while now. I lived in Beijing when they had their first military exercise, and that goes back to 2007. So I think that this has been going on for quite some time, and maybe it's taken a while for people to twig on, but I think that this is a huge issue, and that we've even seen NATO add China in about 17 paragraphs in one of their recent publications, a part of their strategy. And in the past, no one ever talked about China. So I think that there is a big sea change.
I'd just really like to just move on briefly, because I want to make sure that we do look at Serbia, where, of course, we know that President Xi is at the moment. And as Dustin, I don't know if you heard him, but at the very beginning, he was talking about Serbia marking 25 years to the day of NATO bombing the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And that was when President Xi arrived in Belgrade. Why do you think President Xi, I mean, he's really made a big deal about this anniversary, chose that day to arrive. Is that sending a message, obviously not just to Serbia, but to the rest of the world and more of their allies? I'd love to get your take on that.
Yes, first of all, we should remember that that bombing campaign took place when there were horrible things going on.
Yeah, Kosovo. Yeah.
So it's not, but the whole narrative has been turned on its head that China was attacked. And I think it's incredible how Xi Jinping has reframed the entire narrative about a war where people are trying to protect people in Kosovo to, oh my gosh, we're victims. And China does have this kind of national humiliation narrative. And I think that when he went before to Serbia, he did the same thing. He visited the former Chinese embassy that was accidentally bombed by NATO and laid flowers. Now it's been turned into a cultural center. And when I was in Serbia, I visited, and it wasn't yet open. They're waiting to open it. There are people working inside, but they're just waiting for Xi Jinping to have the grand opening. And Chinese people were going in wedding clothes to pose in front of this as like a patriotic wedding photo. So it's really important to the Chinese, and it helps their narrative with Serbia saying, we suffered with you. And we've both been, the West is evil, NATO is evil, we've both suffered with you. So I think that that's the narrative that she is going to be spreading.
And very briefly, Clifford, that's what you would say as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it was very, very pointedly chosen. The narrative has been turned on its head. It's another example of a kind of a nationalist narrative being pushed. And I mean, if you look at
So we're just seeing pictures now of Xi in Serbia with the Serbian president, and those were from earlier today. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's very important to look at how China is pushing itself. This is all about China's emergence on the world stage too. It's very important to have a big visit. I mean, the first state visit was in December 1949, when Mao Zedong went to Moscow to see Stalin. Stalin kept him waiting. He was there until February 1950, so more than 2 months, freezing in a dacha outside Moscow. And eventually there was a Sino-Soviet agreement, but the relationship has in many ways been inverted since then. A lot of this is about showing that China is strong and that China is in a position of strength over Russia too. So China is playing, when I say it's a strategic masterclass, it works on so many levels. And it's like we said in the introduction that, it's about win-win. But as one diplomat said to me once, win-win when it comes to China means China wins twice.
Yeah, gosh, that's a good line, isn't it? Thank you very much, Clifford. And Teresa, thank you for being with us. Do stay with us. It is just time for us to get a little bit of an idea of what has been going on in our chat, in our conversation. And I'm going to hand over to Jared now, who has been very closely following that, along with Biresh, of course, as well. But what sense have you been getting?
Yeah, I mean, lots of people I guess that's a really interesting way how you put it, this strategic masterclass and this win-win situation where China does win twice. And I guess that's we're getting a sense of that through the chat. A lot of people are talking about, I guess, this whole partner versus rival dynamic between Europe and China, and I guess this tightrope of economics and trade and security and who's rocking whose boat. These are all coming through in the comments. I do want to read out one comment that I found really brilliant from Zhu Liang. China, 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 so obsessed with China. Don't you have a life? Not really.
No, we don't.
No, we need a holiday. We've already said that. That's great.
Exactly. But one comment I did want to bring up, this is from Sean Rice. And Sean, thank you so much for your contributions today. He's talking about, I think, the arrests of 3 people here in Germany on suspicion of espionage for China. He's saying it seems the EU is less concerned with IP theft and espionage taking place here. What would you have to say to that, Clifford?
This is really interesting because when you talk to US intelligence contacts, they're worried about Europe and how Europe approaches issues of intelligence and gathering and data protection when it comes to China. They think that Europe doesn't take it seriously enough. And there's been a whole stream of revelations. It started with Huawei, the telecoms company early on, where Europe was sort of thinking, well, but it is cheaper. And so despite all these red flags being waved by America, which may or may not have been for trade reasons, but there definitely was an intelligence element to this. And I think, and the US sometimes is loath to share information with many of its European partners because of a lot of these issues that are going on. And now we're seeing all kinds of, I mean, you're seeing it in the UK too, you're seeing it in many parts of Europe, but Germany seems to be particularly exposed in some ways.
Not just when it comes to China, but also when it comes to Russia, because that was also a matter of arrests that happened. Thanks everybody for sending in your comments and observations. We're all looking at them, and we are going to keep trying to bring them into the conversation. So keep sending them in. Before we just move forward, I just want to sort of highlight the win-win cooperation. And Clifford will know what I'm talking about. It's just, to me, it just seems whenever it comes to China describing its relations with any other country, the phrase win-win cooperation is a go-to. It describes all manner of relationships. And I wonder if it's time for a new phrasing, but maybe you can't answer that. I just wanted to say that, bring that out there.
I feel you might have a phrase.
It's not a question, it was just rhetorical.
So you don't have one, Birish?
Yeah. I mean, I could offer one, but then maybe it's not my place to do so.
You can think about
but
it.
I'd like to move on.
You can think about it, yeah. If you are just joining us, this is News Desk, and we are talking about China's President Xi being in Europe on a European tour. He began in France, meeting Macron and also the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. He's currently in Serbia. We've just been talking about his visit there. And he will also be going to Hungary. And it is Hungary that I want to turn to now. We have with us already Teresa Fallon, who is Director of the Centre for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies, but also joining us, and you can see him now, from Budapest. We have Tamás Matura, who is Associate Professor at Corvinus University in Budapest. And thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have you on. Really wonderful to have you involved in this discussion. And before we start, we just need to point out, of course, that Hungary is a member of both the EU and of NATO. Serbia is not. So Hungary is in a special situation because it's also very good friends with China, isn't it? Why do you think, in particular, President Xi wanted to go to Hungary?
Hello there. Thanks for having me today. Well, you just mentioned win-win cooperation. And I think if there is a country, that is definitely Hungary, where at least the two governments find their win-win cooperation, where both the Hungarian government and the Chinese government can find their gains through this kind of cooperation. And I think it's very telling that the Chinese president decided to go to two very friendly countries in the continent, besides Serbia, of course, Hungary. I think one of the very last countries in the European Union that still pursues an extremely pro-China policy, including economics and politics. So probably that was one of the reasons. Of course, we shouldn't forget, the general excuse, that is the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations. And I also think that this visit was long due because despite the very strong political relations between the two sides, President Xi Jinping have never really made to visit Hungary, at least as a head of state, in the past past 12, 15 years, despite the fact that he has been to Serbia, to Warsaw, and also to the Czech Republic in the past decade. So this visit was long due. And of course, there's one new element that after so many years of trying, finally the Hungarian government has managed to invite a tremendous amount of Chinese investment into the country. Just in the past 2 years or 3 years, China has announced investments in the range of 8 to 10 billion euros. Including one of the largest investments ever in this country, and that is the battery factory by CATL, that alone reaches an amount of 7.3 billion euros.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading that it could be around 30 billion euros by the end of the year, which is a phenomenal amount of money. And you're talking there, obviously, about batteries, but also we know about these electric vehicles, building a plant there. Is that seen as a threat to the rest of Europe, do you think, what Orban, Prime Minister Orban is doing there and pushing for?
Well, by the Prime Minister, of course, it's not a threat, so he doesn't see that a threat. But when it comes to the rest of the Europe, well, it's a big question mark. I think we shouldn't forget that when it comes to the battery producers coming to Hungary, flocking to Hungary, in that case, there have been a lot of rumors suggesting that it was to a major extent the German automakers in the country that pushed the Chinese to come to Hungary, because for the German automakers, you know, we have all three major brands, German brands in Hungary with their production facilities. For them, it seemed to be very important to have the Chinese battery makers nearby their own factories. However, when it comes to the arrival of Chinese automakers to Hungary, I think that was a bit of an unpleasant surprise to the German side. It's a little bit hard to gauge how much they are paced by that, because openly and officially the German automakers say that they don't want to see any kind of European protectionism against China and Chinese automakers. But frankly speaking, I would be surprised if it was true also behind closed doors, because definitely it will be very painful to the German automakers to have Chinese cars produced in the EU, and even if the EU decided to implement certain levels of protectionist measures against the Chinese car makers, those cars being produced within the boundaries of the European Union will be probably exempt. So this is definitely not very good to the Germans.
Yeah. Tomasz, can I just ask you a question about Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and maybe we can have a look at a few images of Viktor Orban as we talk about him, just so the man is in focus. I mean, you have a Prime Minister who shakes hands with President Xi Jinping, but he's also equally friendly with Vladimir Putin. He's also a part of the European Union. How is he getting away with it? And is it because he knows that he will face no repercussions, or is he playing one side against the other? What is the strategy here?
Excuse my cheeky response, but if we want to really find an answer why he's able to get away with all of these, maybe we should ask someone in Berlin, in Paris, in Brussels, or even in Washington. But I do get your point, and
I get your point.
You know,
Go on, please.
You know, my scientific answer is that there is a theory in international relations that is called, you know, the small states foreign policy, and just in a nutshell, it means that smaller countries sometimes can walk away with certain things bigger ones couldn't, simply because we can fly under the radar, simply because major member states of the EU or even Washington itself might think that, okay, whatever Hungary does is so minuscule, it's so irrelevant that let them do that. It's just simply Hungary maybe isn't worth to pay the pain or any kind of efforts. But I think there are limits to that kind of foreign policy, and I've got the feeling that the Hungarian government is getting very close to those limits, not only because of courting the Chinese, but also because of courting the Russians and other illiberal regimes around the world. Mr. Orban labeled Hungary as an illiberal regime a couple of years ago, and ever since he has been trying to forge a global alliance of these leaders, including Turkey's Erdogan, including former president of Brazil, and including Donald Trump, who is a big hope for Mr. Orban should he return to the White House.
And just picking up on that, the whole political side of this. We know that Viktor Orban has used his veto several times within the European space, particularly when it comes to blocking decisions condemning China, for example, over Hong Kong. And there have been accusations that actually Orban is a bit of a puppet of China. Is he?
Well, in certain cases, so I don't really agree to that. And the very reason for it that I have some personal connections in China. And just a couple of years ago, I visited Beijing, and I had a very intriguing conversation with one of the Chinese experts focusing on Europe. And I was told by him that they do understand, sometimes they do even admire Hungary's political gifts to China. You know, the gifts that means that the Hungarian government decided to block or veto certain European movements against the Chinese. But could you please stop it? Told me the Chinese. And I was really surprised by that. Why would the Chinese expert ask the Hungarian side to stop all of these vetoes and kind of stopping Europe from condemning China? And the answer was very simple, that for China, EU-China relations, EU-German relations, or German-China relations are super important. And the actions of the Hungarian government offered an opportunity to Western players to point fingers and to say that, you see, we told you, China is trying to divide and rule Europe, and Hungary is the example. Hungary is the evidence. And from the Chinese perspective, that was really concerning. They were concerned about the quality of their relations to Brussels, to Germany, even to Washington. So therefore, these Hungarian actions also have a certain limit. And I think that the Hungarian government has already understood that, because in the past few years, we haven't seen that many Hungarian vetoes of any kind of European actions against China.
Maybe we just sort of circle back to a comment, or rather a question that has appeared in the chat, Tamas, and maybe this is something that we had already discussed, but maybe you can just touch upon this briefly. This is from Karan Vaghela, who is asking what happened to decoupling and de-risking. I mean, the reason he provides is because business and trade is increasing between China and EU. So decoupling versus de-risking, where are we at when it comes to the relation between EU and China?
Well, I think we have to pay attention to what Germany has been doing. So I have had the pleasure to visit Berlin a couple of times last year and also this year. And once upon a time, we had a closed-door discussion with German policymakers, including members of the Bundestag, including certain researchers. And it was very interesting to listen to their process. So in the past year, Germany has started a research process or a research project focusing on items of imports where Germany has a too big or too high level of import dependency from China. And altogether, they have identified 800 items where Germany's import dependency vis-a-vis China was over 50%, but could have even reached like 90 or 100%. And out of those 800 items, they were able to exclude 500 because those were non-important things. You know, if you can't import napkins from China anymore, Germany will live. But the remaining 300 items are super important, vitally important. And now German economy and German policymakers are trying to find a way how to replace China as the most important source, find, other kind of sources, other countries or other kind of products that could replace this very high level of dependency. And what Germany is doing is something that the rest of Europe is going to follow, except, of course, Hungary. Please always keep that in mind. But the rest of Europe will definitely follow with that kind of approach. So I think de-risking is going on to a certain extent, but it's very slow, very painful, and it also has its own limits.
I'd really like to bring in Teresa Fallon, who I think is still with us, just to get your take on that, Teresa. Teresa is director of the Centre for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies, and we were speaking to her a little bit earlier in this conversation. Where do you stand on that, on what you've just heard there from Tamas about de-risking, decoupling and the pain that is going on? Well,
de-risking is a process and it will take time. this linkages with China have been going on for decades, so we cannot reverse that immediately. And the costs, it's clear in several areas that China will be the lowest cost provider. But COVID taught us something about the over-reliance on PPE, personal protective equipment, when even a face mask could be weaponized, and the over-reliance on special pharmaceuticals. So this is a really key issue, I think, for many here in Brussels, and it was a huge wake-up call, even before the war in Ukraine, where people realized how reliant they were on Russian energy. I think COVID really woke up Europe in regard to their over-reliance on China for many things. So it's a painful process. We have a very mixed landscape, a cacophony of voices. For example, a German businessman said, we believe in de-risking. That's why we're doubling down on our investments in China. So that's a very different view than what they're saying here in Brussels. So I think that they can't even agree what de-risking means. And of course, it's going to be painful. And I think it's hard for governments to sell that to their publics. So China's doing everything they can to make it even more difficult for them as well. And even when people try to source to other countries, for example, in Asia, it's difficult to tell if they're actually sourcing to a Chinese-owned factory in Vietnam, for example. Yeah. And so these complex supply chains and supply chain resilience is the key language everyone's using now, but it's going to be really tough.
Teresa, I just also want to pick up on something that was just said by Tamás. I asked him if he thought that Hungary is China's puppet, and he said actually he didn't think that was the case. What's the view in Brussels?
Well, I respect Tamás's view because I know he's Hungarian. That's kind of tough language. But I think people here in Brussels, my impression is that they really look at Hungary with great concern, and that before they felt more comfortable when they weren't the only kind of member state on the naughty step. I mean, for rule of law issues, at one point, it was Poland and Hungary. Now there's a new government in Poland, so those issues have gone by the wayside. But now we have a new government in Slovakia, so Slovakia and Hungary will find a lot of common areas. It's not nice to be the only country. But we've seen over the years, Hungary has always been the go-to country for Beijing if they wanted to block something or at least to water something down. And the last time this happened, I think sometimes the most interesting things to look at is when Hungary was kind of first said no, and then they kind of changed their mind. So we saw recently, 2021, I believe it was, or 2022, when Europe, the US and the UK put sanctions on people in Xinjiang for human rights violations. And Europe was the first to announce that, and they had to get unanimity on that. And Hungary was like, no, we're not going to get in on this. So I interviewed many people, and I was told that they were kind of strong-armed. And we're told by one large EU member state that if you don't get on board, we're going to make a statement with 26 countries, and you will be left outside of that. And so, so Hungary got on board with that. But after it was announced, immediately, the Hungarian foreign minister made a video for Chinese television saying that they hadn't supported it. Clearly, they had supported it because it passed. So they tried to play both sides. And I think that the Chinese media, it was all over the place of the Hungarian foreign minister saying that they did not support this. So that was a really interesting disinformation point, I thought.
Can I just bring in Clifford over here? Sorry. I mean, what has China got about Europe that Europe hasn't got about China?
Well, I think what's interesting, just on what Tamás and Teresa have just been talking about, I mean, in some ways, a lot of the problem with what Hungary is doing in European terms is stylistic. It's because Orban's approach is because people disagree with him on other aspects, such as Ukraine, but ultimately, what he's doing is not that different from what a lot of other European countries are doing, that they're trying. They basically want the money. I mean, the Germans, you could argue that German companies have been benefiting from these very, very tight links with China for a long, long time. On the one hand, you say, yeah, we bring a list of dissidents to every meeting, but on the other hand, these are just almost paying lip service, and ultimately it's about the money. And I think that there's a certain loss of moral authority, for want of a better word, and I think that's kind of problematic. And while Viktor Orban is obviously has done these things that Teresa points out, and but in effect, I think a lot of countries in Europe, including in Western Europe, would be delighted to have a battery plant or high-speed rail from China. Greece, not all that long ago, sold its port in Piraeus to China. Germany, in Olaf Scholz's backyard in Hamburg, tried to sell the port of Hamburg, and it was only blocked after some major outcry. So I think it's almost like Europe tries to play this sort of the moral and ethical card, but ultimately it's really very strongly informed by the fact that it does like the money. And I think that's ultimately the Chinese sort of realise they can play on this.
Teresa, the Europeans like money.
Well, I think I agree with Clifford on that point, but one point I must clarify. The port of Piraeus, the Greeks initially did not want to sell it to the Chinese, but they were under pressure from the German government under Angela Merkel and the IMF to sell it. And there were others that were expressing concern back then, notably the Americans, that they were concerned that they were selling this port to the Chinese. So I think that it wasn't just that the Greeks wanted to make money, but they were kind of being put under pressure to sell. And now that Germany's having some financial issues, the Greeks love to say, why don't you sell one of these little islands? They're kind of trying to reverse things and trying to put the shoe on the other foot. But this has been the biggest issue, how 1.4 billion customers can't be wrong. And the other issue is lack of strategic foresight. Why wasn't Germany moving up the tech ladder, constantly worrying about your car industry and just missing out on the tech landscape? Can you name, really important tech companies in Europe? I mean, I think Europe is fearful that they're being left behind. There was a book that was published several years ago called How Europe Will Run the 21st Century. Well, it doesn't look like that. I mean, they really were complacent. They're not running the 21st century. And we're seeing Russia and US and China as competitors, and Europe is afraid that they're going to be left on the sidelines. And I think Macron, fears that Europe, as he said, could fail. I call it, I wish I had come up with this wonderful phrase by Andrew Higgins. It's a boring miracle. We kind of take it for granted, but it's taken decades to put all of these rules and regulations and build these institutions over time and build up habits of trust and cooperation. So I'm fearful for the future of Europe. And I think that they really missed a lot of the advanced technology, which is going to rule this period. It's the most important issue right now on the strategic landscape, and they're largely absent. They thought that they could be a regulator, even though they don't have the technology. And that, idea, we have the Brussels effect, that's not really working right now.
Just on the point of technology, Teresa, I can tell you sitting over here in Berlin, your point comes true every day. I'm not going to go into details, but technology and Germany don't seem to really mix.
That is very true.
Your facts.
Tamas, can I just bring you back in? I'd really like to, just what we've been talking about. Do you think that Europe has been outplayed by China, particularly when you're looking at countries like Hungary?
Well, I think the main problem, once again, is Germany, and has been Germany for a while. As many of you, sorry about it. Finally, I have the space and the time to blame a bit the Germans.
Come on, Tamas. Hungary shares a bit of the blame.
Yeah, well, we can share it. But anyway, I think the problem is that what many of you have already alluded to, that German companies, especially the big ones, they really love the money. And we see this kind of bifurcation right now going on, that the big German companies, they insist staying in China, and probably they lobby the German governments to maintain the very amicable relations with the Chinese. Meanwhile, small and medium-sized German companies started to phase out their activities in China and try to find some other places. Now, what's the problem problem with that? The problem is pretty much the same that we've seen before with photovoltaic cells and all the solar panels and other European technologies, where Europe had the advantage, and because large companies really wanted to keep the Chinese market open, that they didn't care about that their technology was, well, let me put it this way, was obtained and acquired by the Chinese. Yeah. And then a lot of German companies were sold to China with their technology and know-how taken to China, and then the Chinese returned to the European market, and they flushed the market with their own products at a small fragment of the original price, killing the remaining European competition. So I think that's the fundamental problem here. And now probably the very same thing is happening to cars and e-mobility, that the large German car producers, they push the EU to keep negotiations and markets open with China, and they're going to lose their markets, and they have been losing their markets in China, and at the very same time they're about to lose a huge share of their home markets back in Europe to the Chinese. And yes, Hungary is opening a gateway to the Chinese to help them to penetrate European markets when it comes to e-mobility. But I think Theresa already mentioned that it was up to Europe to maintain its competitive edge, and we missed that.
Yeah. So the question that we have is, how much does China really need Europe? Tamas?
Now I think more than before, as we see the structural problems of the Chinese economy and this, flattening of the Chinese growth rate. China is turning back towards manufacturing, and because their own people do not consume, therefore the only way out is to increase their exports. Now the European Union is probably the only willing last big market to absorb Chinese extra exports, while the United States is getting more and more protectionist. So I think Europe now has a little bit better negotiating position than before, but maybe it's just a window of opportunity. And of course, we have to be very careful because it really depends on what happens in the United States in November. If Donald Trump returns to the White House, there's a fair chance that Europe and China once again will find themselves on the same side.
Thank you very much for joining us from Budapest. We really appreciate your time and your analysis. Absolutely great. That's Tamas Matura, and also Theresa Fallon, who also has been with us pretty much for an entire hour. Thank you again very much for joining us from Brussels. We've really appreciated the conversation. So thank you both. And hopefully we'll have you on this conversation another time soon. Thank you. Just before we finish with that, I'd love to get your final take on all this, Clifford, and particularly with that question, how much does China really need Europe? Does China really need Europe? Do you agree with what Tamas was saying, that because of what's going on in the US, or is it just part of many places that that's useful to China, many markets?
Well, I think it's very interesting, the fact that the US is ultimately, China sees everything in terms of the US. And Europe, as the European Union, is a counterbalance in power politics terms to the US. Whereas the European Union in its current iteration is split, it's divided, it doesn't know what it's looking at. Since Brexit, with the departure of EU, in many ways was a disaster for the EU as a foreign policy entity, because the UK was pretty good at keeping Europe honest when it came to dealing with these authoritarian states, for want of a better expression. And what came out, I think, of the talk is that everyone blamed Germany. And now part of that is the fact we're sitting here. But I mean, even when I was talking about Piraeus and how Greece had sold Piraeus, and as Theresa quite rightly pointed out, it was actually under pressure from Merkel that happened because of the global financial collapse. But yeah, I think ultimately China needs Europe as a as an ally. China doesn't really do alliances, but it wants to keep Europe on side as much as possible. It doesn't really matter how much of Europe is on side. If it gets the French being positive one week and the Germans the following week, and then you've got a few Central European countries doing it, that's fine. As long as Europe is not acting as one, and as long as Europe is not acting in close harmony with the US, then the situation works really well for
Is it also fair to say that even though President Macron talks about strategic autonomy, even if this vision gets realized in its entirety, which when it comes to Europe is a big open question, whenever it does come into fruition, it's going to take years for that to happen. But in the interim, Europe, the way it is, works really well for Chinese interests when it comes to countering the United States and playing Europe against the United States. Would that be a fair assessment?
Very much so. I've never really understood the term strategic autonomy because you can't even get the two biggest, closest partners who are neighbours and who are the driving force of the whole economic union to agree. Germany, but France as well. The man who would be the architect. So much is based on stylistic approaches.
But he hasn't really articulated his plan, right?
No,
he just keeps talking about strategic autonomy without describing how that will be implemented. But
and which US diplomat was it says, who do you call when you want to call Europe? That nobody's ever answered that question. That question has never been answered. It's not von der Leyen because she may be gone after the elections.
Could be the Ghostbusters, but then whom are you going to call?
Oh, thank you very much, Clifford, for being with us. Absolutely great to have you on always and to get all your insights, especially after all your time living there and all your connections. So thank you very much. Poll.
Yeah, I think we're about at that stage where we would like to know what the results of the poll are.
That's right. So we were asking you the questions. Thank you to the 385 of you who voted. We really do appreciate it. The question was, what do you think defines China-Europe relations? So partnership, rivalry, both, or it's too complicated? Both, depending on the situation, is leading at 37%, followed, and there's a tie, I've just noticed, between partnership and rivalry, both of them on 23%. And it's too complicated, 17%.
Thank you very much.
That's a revelation. I thought that it'll be too complicated to be the winner, but then...
I did too. I mean, I guess people are hedging their bets a little bit by choosing both, but I did think it's too complicated might come out on top or at least do better. But I think it's interesting that we do have a tie between a partnership and rivalry, which kind of plays into the both.
Yes, that is why we have the poll question, so we are surprised by it at the end. And it's fantastic. Thank you so much for participating. We learned something about the mood as well on that, don't we?
We absolutely do. Yeah, thank you very much for joining us.
And that's it for this conversation on a news desk. We're going to be back again next Wednesday. Make sure you can to check out our community tab. That's where you will find the question, the subject for next week, 24 hours in advance. So essentially, in simple language, you can check on Tuesday what the subject on Wednesday is going to be and then join us back again on Wednesday. We still don't know what the subject's going to be. Maybe we talk about strategic autonomy and try and give us some direction. Or Germany and internet connections. Tell us what you think.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much
See you
for
next
watching.
week.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.